Latin is a member of the broad family of Italic languages. Its alphabet, the Latin alphabet, emerged from the Old Italic alphabets, which in turn were derived from the Greek and Phoenician scripts. Historical Latin came from the prehistoric language of the Latium region, specifically around the river Tiber, where Roman civilization first developed. How and when Latin came to be spoken by the Romans are questions that have long been debated. Various influences on Latin of Celtic dialects in northern Italy, the non-Indo-European Etruscan language in central Italy, and the Greek of southern Italy have been detected, but where these influences entered the native Latin is not known for certain. Surviving Latin literature consists almost entirely of classical Latin in its broadest definition. It includes a polished and sometimes highly stylized literary language sometimes termed Golden Latin, which spans the 1st century BC and the early years of the 1st century AD. However, throughout the history of ancient Rome, the spoken language differed in both grammar and vocabulary from that of literature, and is referred to as Vulgar Latin. In addition to Latin, Greek was often spoken by the well-educated elite, who studied it in school and acquired Greek tutors from among the influx of enslaved educated Greek prisoners of war. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, the Greek coin of Hellenism remained current and was never replaced by Latin. Origins. The name Latin derives from the Italic tribal group named Latini that settled at some time in Latium, and the dialect spoken by these people. The Italic languages form a centum subfamily of the Indo-European language family. These include the Romance, Germanic, Celtic, and Hellenic languages, and a number of extinct ones. Broadly speaking, in initial syllables the Indo-European simple vowels *e, *a, *q, short and long, are usually retained in Latin. The schwa Indo-Germanicum appears in Latin as a. Diphthongs are also preserved in Old Latin, but in Classical Latin some tend to become monophthongs. In non-initial syllables, there was more vowel reduction. The most extreme case occurs with short vowels in medial open syllables. All are reduced to a single vowel, which appears as I in most cases, but E before R, and U before an L, which is followed by O or U. In final syllables, short E and O are usually raised to I and U, respectively. Consonants are generally more stable. However, the Indo-European voiced aspirates BH, DH, GH, GWH are not maintained, becoming F, F, H, F respectively at the beginning of a word, but usually B, D, G, V elsewhere. Note that non-initial DH becomes B next to R or U, e.g. *HRUDH red, greater than rub, e.g. Rubio, to be read, word, greater than verbum. S between vowels famously becomes R, e.g. floss, flower, gen. Floris, iro, I will be, versus root S, aurora, dawn, less than ozoza, soror, sister, less than sosor, less than sweza. Of the original 8 cases of Proto-Indo-European Latin inherited 6. Nominative, vocative, accusative, genitive, dative, and ablative. The Indo-European locative survived in the declensions of some place names and a few common nouns, such as Roma, Rome, and domus, home. Vestiges of the instrumental case may remain in adverbial forms ending in E. It is believed that the earliest known inscription is a 7th century BC. Pin known as the Praenestine fibula, which reads Manios med fehagna majoroi, Manius made me for numerius. Old Latin. Old Latin refers to the period of Latin texts before the age of Classical Latin, extending from textual fragments that probably originated in the Roman monarchy to the written language of the late Roman Republic about 75 BC. Almost all the writing of its earlier phases is inscriptional. Some phonological characteristics of Older Latin are the case endings os and om. In many locations, Classical Latin turned into vocalic per second second into r. This had implications for declension. Early Classical Latin, onus, onerous, classical honor, onerous. Some Latin texts preserve per second in this position, such as the Carmen Arvales Lases Valeries. Classical Latin. Classical Latin is the form of the Latin language used by the ancient Romans in classical Latin literature. In the latest and narrowest philological model, its use spanned the Golden Age of Latin literature, broadly the 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD, possibly extending to the Silver Age, broadly the 1st and 2nd centuries. It was a polished written literary language based on the refined spoken language of the upper classes. Classical Latin differs from Old Latin, the earliest inscriptional language and the earliest authors, such as Ennius, Plautus and others, in a number of ways. For example, the early ominous endings shifted into ominous ones, and some lexical differences also developed, such as the broadening of the meaning of words. In the broadest and most ancient sense, the classical period includes the authors of early Latin, the Golden Age and the Silver Age. Golden Age. The Golden Age of Latin literature is a period consisting roughly of the time from 75 BC to AD 14, covering the end of the Roman Republic and the reign of Augustus Caesar. In the currently used philological model, this period represents the peak of Latin literature. Since the earliest post-classical times, the Latin of those authors has been an ideal norm of the best Latin, which other writers should follow. Silver Age. In reference to Roman literature, the Silver Age covers the first 2 centuries AD directly after the Golden Age. Literature from the Silver Age is more embellished with mannerisms. Late Latin. Late Latin is the administrative and literary language of late antiquity in the late Roman Empire and states that succeeded the Western Roman Empire over the same range. By its broadest definition, it is dated from about 200 AD to about 900 AD, when it was replaced by written Romance languages. Opinion concerning whether it should be considered classical is divided. The authors of the period looked back to a classical period they believed should be imitated, and yet their styles were often classical. According to the narrowest definitions, late Latin did not exist, and the authors of the times are to be considered medieval. Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin is a blanket term covering vernacular dialects of the Latin language spoken from earliest times in Italy until the latest dialects of the Western Empire. Diverging still further, evolved into the early Romance languages, whose writings began to appear about the 9th century. This spoken Latin differed from the literary language of Classical Latin in its grammar and vocabulary. It is likely to have evolved over time, with some features not appearing until the late Empire. Other features are likely to have been in place much earlier. Because there are few phonetic transcriptions of the daily speech of these Latin speakers, Vulgar Latin must be studied mainly by indirect methods. Knowledge of Vulgar Latin comes from a variety of sources. First, the comparative method reconstructs items of the mother language from the attested Romance languages. Also, prescriptive grammar texts from the late Latin period condemn some usages as errors, providing insight into how Latin was actually spoken. The solecisms and non-classical usages occasionally found in late Latin texts also shed light on the spoken language. A windfall source lies in the chance finds of wax tablets such as those found at Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. The Roman cursive script was used on these tablets. Romance languages. The Romance languages, a major branch of the Indo-European language family, comprise all languages that descended from Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. The Romance languages have more than 700 million native speakers worldwide, mainly in the Americas, Europe, and Africa, as well as in many smaller regions scattered through the world. All Romance languages descend from Vulgar Latin, the language of soldiers, settlers, and slaves of the Roman Empire, which was substantially different from that of the Roman literati. Between 200 BC and AD 100, the expansion of the empire and the administrative and educational policies of Rome made Vulgar Latin the dominant vernacular language over a wide area which stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the west coast of the Black Sea. During the empire's decline and after its collapse and fragmentation in the 5th century, Vulgar Latin began to evolve independently within each local area, and eventually diverged into dozens of distinct languages. The overseas empires established by Spain, Portugal and France after the 15th century then spread these languages to other continents. About two-thirds of all Romance speakers are now outside Europe. In spite of the multiple influences of pre-Roman languages and later invasions, the phonology, morphology, lexicon, and syntax of all Romance languages are predominantly derived from Vulgar Latin. As a result, the group shares a number of linguistic features that set it apart from other Indo-European branches. Ecclesiastical Latin. Ecclesiastical Latin is a broad and analogous term referring to the Latin language as used in documents of the Roman Catholic Church, its liturgies and during some periods the preaching of its ministers. Ecclesiastical Latin is not a single style. The term merely means the language promulgated at any time by the Church. In terms of stylistic periods, it belongs to Late Latin in the Late Latin period, Medieval Latin in the Medieval period, and so on through to the present. One may say that, starting from the Church's decision in the early Late Latin period to use a simple and unornamented language that would be comprehensible to ordinary Latin speakers and yet still be elegant and correct, Church Latin is usually a discernible substyle within the major style of the period. Its authors in the New Latin period are typically paradigmatic of the best Latin, and that is true in contemporary times. The decline in its use within the last 100 years has been a matter of regret to some, who have formed organizations inside and outside the Church to support its use and to use it. Medieval Latin. Medieval Latin refers to the literary and administrative Latin used in the Middle Ages. It exhibits much variation between individual authors, mainly due to poor communications in those times between different regions. The individuality is characterized by a different range of solecisms and by the borrowing of different words from Vulgar Latin or from the local vernacular. Some styles show features intermediate between Latin and Romance languages, others are closer to Classical Latin. The stylistic variations came to an end with the rise of nations and new empires in the Renaissance period, and the authority of the first universities imposing a new style, Renaissance Latin. Renaissance Latin. Renaissance Latin is a name given to the Latin written during the European Renaissance in the 14th–16th centuries, particularly distinguished by the distinctive Latin style developed by the humanist movement. Ad fontes was the general cry of the humanists, and as such their Latine style sought to purge Latin of the medieval Latin vocabulary and stylistic accretions that it had acquired in the centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire, they looked to Golden Age Latin literature, and especially to Cicero in prose and Virgil in poetry, as the arbiters of Latin style. They abandoned the use of the sequence and other accentual forms of meter, and sought instead to revive the Greek formats that were used in Latin poetry during the Roman period. The humanists condemned the large body of medieval Latin literature as Gothic for them, a term of abuse, and believed instead that only ancient Latin from the Roman period was real Latin. The humanists also sought to purge written Latin of medieval developments in its orthography. They insisted, for example, that A be written out in full wherever it occurred in Classical Latin. Medieval scribes often wrote E instead of A. They were much more zealous than medieval Latin writers in distinguishing T from C. Because the effects of palatalization made them homophones, medieval scribes often wrote, for example, esham for esham. Their reforms even affected handwriting. Humanists usually wrote Latin in a script derived from Carolingian minuscule, the ultimate ancestor of most contemporary lowercase typefaces, avoiding the black letter scripts used in the Middle Ages. Erasmus even proposed that the then traditional pronunciations of Latin be abolished in favor of his reconstructed version of Classical Latin pronunciation. The humanist plan to remake Latin was largely successful, at least in education. Schools now taught the humanistic spellings, and encouraged the study of the texts selected by the humanists, largely to the exclusion of later Latin literature. On the other hand, while humanist Latin was an elegant literary language, it became much harder to write books about law, medicine, science or contemporary politics in Latin while observing all of the humanists' norms of vocabulary purging and classical usage. Because humanist Latin lacked precise vocabulary to deal with modern issues, their reforms accelerated the transformation of Latin from a working language to an object of antiquarian study. Their attempts at literary work, especially poetry, often have a strong element of pastiche. New Latin. New Latin is a post-medieval version of Latin, now used primarily in international scientific vocabulary and systematics. The term came into widespread use towards the end of the 1890s among linguists and scientists. Classicists use the term Neo-Latin to describe the use of the Latin language for any purpose, scientific or literary, after the Renaissance. Although, for example, the editors of the Itati Renaissance Library call their Renaissance Latin language texts Neo-Latin as well. Such contemporary Latin includes ecclesiastical use, as well as translations from modern languages into Latin and the occasional poetry. Under the name of Living Latin, some have advocated reviving the language as a means of spoken communication.